Hello, welcome to the Maggie in Madrid. Today I've got a guest on. His name is Kevin Ingram, and he's a historian who's been doing a lot of research into the Conversos, that is, the descendants of Jews who were forced to convert to Catholicism. Now, you might think that this is a little bit of a depressing topic, but Kevin has a new spin on it, and he talks a lot about their interesting role in modern Spain and how they really changed Spanish society. So it's a really good conversation. Before we move on to the interview, I'd also like to add that this is going to be one of the last episodes in this series. I've been running the podcast for about a year, and I'll take a break over Christmas. When I come back after Christmas, the podcast won't be quite as regular. So I'm thinking of moving to a monthly format. And that's because I'll be working on the update to Lonely Planet's Madrid guide. So I'll be flat out, but I promise I'll try and keep bringing you content, but maybe not quite as regularly as before. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hello, Kevin. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you for talking to me.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. And this episode should be airing just before a special event for you, which is on November the 21st at the Secret Kingdom's bookshop. You'll be presenting your book, which is Converso Non-conformism in Early Modern Spain. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, this book started many years ago. Probably it came out of a dissertation I was writing when I was at doing my PhD in University of California, San Diego. Mm-hmm. And I won't go into it now, but I became interested in the Conversos. I was researching a group of humanists in Seville. And it occurred to me that almost all of them were from Converso backgrounds, some very obviously so, some not so obviously so, because for various reasons they wanted to disguise their Jewish ancestry.
Yeah, so we should get started with defining the word Converso. But before we jump into that, let's just tell everyone that they can join this event and see you talking in person about this book and ask you questions if they want, and get their hands on a copy, because I believe it's on sale in the bookshop.
Yeah, yes, yeah. They've even placed it in the in the front of the bookshop in the scaparati. So yes, very pleased.
That's the front window for anyone who doesn't speak Spanish. So, and the event will start at 8 p.m. and I believe people get tickets on Eventbrite. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, or in the or in the bookshop itself. Yeah. Or just come along on the night, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you can chance your arm with it. And the Secret Kingdoms is on Calle Moratin, if people don't know that, but I'll put a link in the show notes. And you just gave us a brief overview of how you came to write that book. But before we get into it all, we should kind of define what is a converso. So can you tell me about that and how the phenomenon began?
Yeah. Okay. So most people think that the phenomenon began in 1492, when the Jews in Spain were given the ultimatum either to convert to Catholicism or leave the country. And as a result of this, many of those Jews remained, and they converted to Catholicism, mostly because it was so difficult to think in terms of a life outside of Spain when they had to leave all their possessions behind.
Yes, yeah. They were
so we think of that as the sort of birth of the Conversos. Sorry.
No, I just heard they were sewing gold into their clothes and things because they had to give everything up and sort of, so I was wondering, do you know what proportion of Jews decided to leave and how many decided to stay?
Well, this changes all the time. Originally, ridiculous figures were given that the Jewish population was probably 150,000, and maybe 100,000 left and 50,000 stayed. Now, I think a more reasonable figure is that the Jewish population of Spain was about 80,000, and over half remained, perhaps 35, 40,000 left, most going to Portugal.
Okay, and you're saying that most people believe that that was the start of it, but you're saying it started earlier, this phenomenon.
Yeah, well, there was something called the 1391 pogrom, and this was in the year 1391. There were uprisings against Jewish communities throughout Spain. It started in Seville. And after that year, subsequently, in the wake of that, there was a mass conversion of Jews to Christianity, again under duress. Threatened for their lives, basically, and so they not immediately. A lot converted immediately, but in the next 2 or 3 decades, we find that a large number, possibly as much as half the population of the Jews at the time, converted to Christianity, and this really was the start of the Converso phenomenon.
Yeah, I kind of going against my own advice here and going off down the side road. But I do know that relative to the rest of Europe, Spain was kind of more, say, lenient, if that's the right word, probably not tolerant is a better word, of Jewish communities, because in the UK, certainly, I mean, in England, certainly, they were treated far more harshly. But this anti-Jewish sentiment was there for quite a long time.
Yeah, that's right. It was, as you said, more tolerant. Spain was a multicultural environment. There were lots of people, Muslims in the country, large population of Jews. And Christian society needed these. The Jews were quite intellectual. They were also good for the economy. They were businessmen. And so they were needed. And what we find is that even after the Jews had been expelled from England and France in the 12th century, that Jewish population thrived in Spain. But as a result of proselytizing from the new mendicant orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans especially, the Jews were put under a lot of pressure during the 14th century. This is leading up to the 1391 pogrom, to convert to Christianity. So we find, although in the 12th and 13th century, their position was relatively stable, progressively it got worse up until 1391, as I said, when there was this pogrom, when you would find that through these proselytizing campaigns, through this pressure put on the Jewish communities, through pressure from the rank and file old Christians in the cities, that they were forced to convert. And so we get the first big wave of conversion.
I also think that when we use the word conversos, I was wondering if we should use Judeo-conversos, or what did people generally call Muslims who they were later forced to convert?
They're called Moriscos. The Muslims, we usually use the term Moriscos.
Okay.
Yeah, and then for Jewish converts, we can call them new Christians. We can call them conversos or Judeo-conversos. The old term was Marranos. But Marrano, some people still use it to mean a converso that maintained his old religion. In other words, he was sort of a backsliding Catholic. He continued to practice. He was a Judaizer. But the term generally today is not used because Marrano means pig. So as well, so in Portuguese, so we tend not to use that term any longer. So converso is the term I use.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's like the term mudeja, which is the term mudeja, which is also kind of insulting to, but I mean, I'm talking about former Muslim populations who, this is kind of like a tamed animal or something in Arabic. But sort of lost its association. So a lot of Spanish people use it not knowing that it's pejorative.
Yeah, the term mudéjar was used for the Muslims who remained in Christian territory after the reconquest.
Mm-hmm.
So those who were outside of the Kingdom of Granada, which was a Muslim kingdom up until 1492. Mm-hmm. So those that decided they were going to remain in Christian territory, they weren't persecuted. They were even allowed to maintain their mosques, although they couldn't build new ones, but they could repair them. And so there was a small population of Muslims from the mid 13th century onwards, and those were designated mudéjares.
Okay. All right. And of course, both these groups were then persecuted by the Inquisition. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, if I just go back a step. So first thing is, this should not be complicated, but it can get quite complicated. The term converso was applied by an old Christian community to not only the converts, because it means convert, but to their descendants as well. So it doesn't matter how far you were away from the original conversion. If you came from a family of Jewish background, you were known as a converso.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what happened then was that you have a large number of Jews that have now converted to Christianity in the 15th century.
Mm-hmm.
As a result of that, of course, they now can enter into Christian society, into Christian positions in town halls, in universities, in the church. So whereas before they were very restricted as Jews in what they did, now the society is open to them. And as a result
but they
of
are
that,
under. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
They are under a certain amount of suspicion, though.
They're definitely under suspicion, and they're under. But more than that, there develops quite a lot of envy towards them, especially sort of a middle sort or a middle class converso, that is prominent in the large cities like Toledo, for example, or Seville, who do tend to do very well in that society. They do well in business, they do well in universities, and they do well in politics as well. They work for the noble families as accountants and as teachers as well. And so it's not just that there's suspicion towards them. There is some suspicion towards them. That is definitely true, because old Christian society still believes, because they stay in the same neighborhoods, they still have access to Jewish communities as well, that maybe in private they're Judaizing, which I think in the first generation and possibly the second generation is quite true. Although that becomes less and less as we go through the generations. But the major problem, I think, or at least an equal problem, is the fact that they are doing well. When old Christian society wanted the Jews to convert, they were very happy with that. But what they didn't want them to do was compete with them in society. And when they compete, and they seem to be doing it at an advantage, then this starts to create problems. So you have, one, the suspicions, but two, the kind of envy of people who you've associated or you've thought of as people who are inferior to you. Now they're holding positions that are much better than you in society. And this creates an enormous amount of enmity towards the conversos. In fact, by the mid-15th century, there's more enmity towards the conversos than there is towards the Jews, who are quite a subdued community by this stage. And and two things happen as a result of this. One, we get something called the Limpieza de Sangre statutes. Now, Limpieza de Sangre was a statute that was created to make sure that conversos didn't enter into public office, or church office, public office, enter into the universities, very often enter into the town guilds. So they were restricting their access to a society, basically placing them in the same position as they've been placed, as their ancestors have been placed as Jews, which is obviously to them, to Conversos, completely unfair. What have we gained by converting to Christianity? Yeah? That was the one thing that happened. And that was a major problem for Conversos. The second thing that happened was that there was so many attacks on these Jewish communities these Converso communities, that the Catholic monarchs, Isabel and Ferdinand, in 1478, were persuaded to create an inquisition, known as the Spanish Inquisition. There had been other inquisitions before, Roman inquisitions. There was a famous medieval inquisition. But this was a Spanish Inquisition, which had nothing to do with the papacy. It was created as a council of court. It was created by the Catholic monarchs. And it was there to make sure that Conversos were good Catholics. In other words, it investigated claims that Converso families were backsliding, that they were observing Jewish rites in private. This created an enormous amount of tension, an enormous amount of pressure on the Conversos themselves.
Could they be denounced by somebody?
They were denounced by people. It started in 1479. In the end, I think there was something like 12 tribunals throughout Spain and Aragon, throughout Castile and Aragon. It started in Seville in 1478 and then spread to Ciudad Real and Córdoba and Toledo, etc. What happened was that there was a period of grace. And then in that time, the Conversos, it's horrible. This is a horrible thing. The Conversos were asked to come to the Inquisition and declare if they or their family members had been observing Jewish rituals or rites in private, to come and to tell the Inquisition. And if they did that, they would probably only get a stiff fine. They wouldn't be burnt at the stake, for example. So, which of course many did. But then others, their neighbors very often, all Christian neighbors, would come to the Inquisition and say, oh, there's somebody who hasn't come forward. And we know that they've been observing Jewish rituals in private. So this is what happened with the Inquisition, and as a result of which, of course, many Jews were, in those first years of the Inquisition, at the first 2 decades especially, were burnt at the stake. Okay, so that's what's happening with the Conversos. Now, the other thing is that it was felt that the Conversos would never be good Christians while Jews were present in the country. So while there's a Jewish community, there are Jewish rabbis, the Conversos then have access to their old religion, and it's going to be much more difficult for them to be sincere Christians. And this was behind the edict of 1492 by the Catholic monarchs, giving the remains of that Jewish community the option, either convert also to Christianity or leave the country. And that, so we're back at 1492. But a lot had happened before 1492.
Yeah. And then going on from then, my understanding is that the Inquisition was very powerful, but gradually its influence began to wane through the generations. So you carried on having the autos de fe, which were the trials of faith, but not very many people would end up being burnt at the stake. It was more kind of fines being dished out and people sent into exile and things like that. And then, this tension kind of died down a bit. Is that correct, more or less?
Yeah. We don't have 2,000 or so Jews were Conversos were probably burnt at the stake in the first 30 years. Many were imprisoned, lost everything. I mean, the fines were harsh, and also, there are other ways of castigating them. Sent to the galleys, those kind of things. But probably, yes, the largest number of Jews Conversos were burnt at the stake before 1520. After 1520, the Inquisition sort of moved away from its interest in Judaizers to its interest in Protestants. So after Luther comes along, the worry then was that that there were Protestant cells being created in Spain itself, and people became very anxious about the Inquisition itself became anxious about that. So they tended to investigate people who they thought humanists and others, members of the clergy, who they thought were reading Protestant literature. So, but the thing was, and you'll read this in the general history books, that there was a move away. There was an interest in move away from Jews and interest in Protestants. But they were the same people. They were the same people. They came from the same families very often. It was the Conversos that became interested in Protestantism, which makes sense.
Okay, that's interesting.
People just think, oh yes, well no, so the Conversos were off the hook. No, they were the same families very often. They were the same intellectuals. It made sense to Converso. You're not at home in a Catholicism, the rituals of Catholicism, and you're looking to create a Catholicism that is just based on some just basic principles. What Erasmus said, they were Erasmians before Protestants as well. What Erasmus said was the Philosophia Christi, the philosophy of Christ, which is just based on the Sermon on the Mount. And that obviously appealed to people who, it allowed them to engage more with Christianity. It was like a pared down Christianity that they could, that they felt much more at home with. So, again, this is where I come into the story. This is my interest in the Conversos. It's the Conversos as reformers in 16th century Spain. Up until recently.
And you were saying you stumbled upon a few figures during your research.
Lots. They're nearly all the great reformers, all the great Spanish humanists. They're, almost to a man or woman are from Converso background.
And how would you identify them as Conversos? So were these people always having to reveal their ancestry?
No, this is something that a lot of it really is through circumstantial. We have a lot of information. For example, the great mystics and the early Jesuits themselves, which also are largely Conversos. The first Jesuits are largely come from Converso families. We have a lot of information on some of those families, and that's very clear that they are Converso. Teresa of Avila, for example, great mystic. We know that her family were prosecuted for Judaizing in Toledo, so we know that they are. Other ones, really, you have to do a little bit of research into their family backgrounds, into their intellectual environments, into what they're writing as well, to see that what they're doing is promoting Conversos instead of attacking them. Promoting people from a Jewish background instead of attacking. But that's what I got involved with.
Is there any truth to the idea that there might be certain family names that could identify you as a Converso, or is that not true at all?
Yeah. There are certain family names. For me, well, actually, I've got here, because I was thinking about this before this talk. And I remember that some years ago, there was something called a composición that was found. It was a composición. This was a list of names in 1510 in Seville. And these were names of Conversos who they joined the list because they were paying a certain fine or a sum of money so that their ancestors' names, the ancestors who had been convicted of Judaizing, many of whom were burnt at the stake. So that would be wiped from the Inquisition records. So what they gave in the composición was their names and professions. And from this, we get a very good idea, at least from Seville, about the family names or the names they had taken. when they converted from Judaism to Christianity. And there are many, many names of cities. And that seems to be where they actually converted. So the names of cities. So if I've got a list
could
here.
you give an example? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we have lots of Córdoba, Valladolid, Zafra, Carmona, Cuenca, Palencia, Jaén, Talavera, Antequera, Sanlúcar de Barrameda, Seville in enormous number, Burgos, Écija, Ocaña, lots and lots. Professions, not so much, but there are certain surnames which seem to be, which time and time again, conversos adopt. Núñez, Rodríguez, Pérez, López, Sánchez, Hernández, lots of them. Those are the names I've got. Now, as far as their professions are concerned, which I think is also interesting, again, very often there's a continuation from the professions that their Jewish forefathers had. But they're fairly limited. The conversos are urban dwellers. Generally, I mean, there are farmers, there are people in a rural background, but generally they're associated with with an urban environment. So what we get in this composición is lots of jewelers, merchants, spice merchants, obviously rag merchants, money lenders, tailors, hosiers, button makers, silversmiths, chemists, notaries, and clothes merchants. Those generally are the kind of professions that they took on.
I've also heard in Madrid tanners, in lavapiés.
Tanners, yeah. Yeah, tanners is true. The leather industry, and also because shoemakers, they were also cobblers.
Your interest is in, you've saying that there are these really amazing figures that you've discovered who changed Spanish society, or the modernizers, and written a whole book, so we don't have time to go into all of them. But would you like to maybe highlight one or two of these people?
Yeah, well, it started really with the Converso intellectuals were attracted to humanism. Humanism was important to them because the idea of the humanist, which goes back to obviously associating the early Italian humanists, associated with the classical community of Rome and Greece. And it was a community that you gained, that your nobility came from merit, from what you'd achieved in society, not through blood. And this was very interesting, obviously, to Conversos, because they've been marginalized through their blood. So the idea was, if you can be ennobled by merit, that was important. As well as Christian humanism, which comes from Erasmus. So the idea is they've a pared down Christianity, which is available to everyone. So they're very, very much attracted to humanism. And they're also attracted to mysticism, because that is a private Christianity, which you don't have to worry about anybody except your own access to God. So we get all the early great mystics, Teresa de Avila, Juan de Avila, Luis de León, Luis de Granada. These are names that are not so well known today. Well, obviously, if you're an academic, you'll know, but they were tremendously important at the time.
Saint Teresa is still very well known.
And Saint Teresa is still very well known.
Did she come head to head with the Inquisition at all?
Yeah, to start with, because we're talking about an environment which is post-Tridentine. It was after the Tridentine Council, after the Council of Trent. So we're talking about a Counter-Reformation environment where the church was very sensitive to anything. They wanted to control everything. They were worried about Protestantism. So there was, after 1565, which was the end of the Council of Trent, there was a greater emphasis on controlling the Christian society, Catholic society. And mystics, as you can understand, were outside the control of that society. Mystical visions are outside the control of that. So Teresa and her supporters were investigated many times by the Inquisition. Of course, now we think of her as the great saint of Spain, but at the time she was a character that was was suspect.
Mm-hmm. Any other figures you'd like to
Oh, yeah. Well,
discuss?
again, people not so well known today, but all the great Spanish humanists from Antonio Nebrija, Juan Luis Vives, who's both his parent, well, his father was burnt at the stake. His mother was exhumed. Her bones were exhumed and burnt at the stake for Judaizing. Vives was a great friend of Erasmus. The Valdez brothers, Juan and Alfonso Valdez. Alfonso Valdez was the great secretary of Carlos V. These were all early humanists. Benito Arias Montano, Juan de Mariana. These are just people off the top of my head, but they were the creme de la creme of intellectual life in Spain.
Mm-hmm. So you said these people might be taken to court by the Inquisition. What would the process of that look like?
Well, to start with, when the Inquisition tribunals were set up, as I said, the first one was in Seville, and then every couple of years, it seemed like another tribunal was set up somewhere else. So as soon as the tribunal was set up in a city, then there'd be something called an edict of grace, which it was a grace period. It was a period of 3 months when conversos could come along, and if they had anything to declare to the Inquisition, they could would clear their conscience. They could come and they could tell the Inquisition, and then they would get off with a fine.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it would be noted who that converso was that had been Judaizing, what family was from, and whatever, and this was used against the families very often later on. So you didn't get scot-free. Nothing was scot-free with the Inquisition.
Were they told what they were accused of?
Well, at this stage, if you just came and you told the Inquisition, you'd probably say something. I imagine that most converso families, what they wanted to do, they didn't want to get investigated by the Inquisition. They thought, okay, we'll pay a fine and we'll give ourselves up to the Inquisition. And we'll tell them something. They probably didn't tell them everything, but they said, oh yeah, occasionally I observed the Sabbath, and which was known to the Inquisition anyway. They knew that Jews and conversos who were observing their old faith would on a Friday they would cleanse themselves, they would bathe, and they wouldn't cook and things of this nature. They certainly, during that day they wouldn't work. And so they'd say something like that. I don't work on a Saturday. I have to work on a Saturday. Or, I'm I generally, all the family bathes before the Saturday, before observing Saturday, something like the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
So they would be okay. Now, so the other ones who didn't come and give themselves up to the Inquisition, or even later still, that they were suspected of being Judaizing in the community, then somebody would very often come to the Inquisition, and they would say, I suspect so and so, Juan de Sevilla or Juan Núñez or Sanchez or Pérez of Judaizing, and then the Inquisition would call them in, and they would ask them, say, what's this all about? And they'd give them a chance to say, well, I have no idea what this is all about. I don't
Were
Judaize.
people able to make accusations anonymously, or were they
always? You never knew who the person was who was making the accusation.
So that's an open door to people to exploit that.
Completely. Completely. And of course, the Inquisition then, it's not like a trial now. It's the Inquisition then, there was whether they were satisfied. It depended on the individual inquisitors, whether they were satisfied with the explanation. Oh, no, I've always had problems with this neighbor. It's nothing, whatever. And then the accused could bring in witnesses for the accused, and they would say, oh, yeah, he's always been a good Christian. I haven't seen anything. And if the Inquisition are happy with that, they'll probably let it go. If they're not, they'll just say they'll leave them in prison for a month or so, and they'll say, okay, they'll bring them back out again and ask them same questions. So would they like to relieve themselves of their sins or whatever? They say, no, there's no sins or whatever. And if they still don't believe them, then they'll torture them. And then under torture, very often, of course, the people would say, yeah, I'm Judaizing. Well, were they Judaizing? Or were they just wanted to escape the torture? And very often conversos would say later on, no, I only said that to avoid the torture. But this was the process.
There are some misconceptions about the kind of torture that they would subject people to, because that was very clearly stated by the Pope that they weren't allowed to draw blood. I know that they had to use methods that, the idea of the Iron Maiden and everything is a little bit not really correct.
No, they would torture them. They would stretch their limbs, and so so their limbs would out of place, and they would tie their stomach so that their intestines would sort of come out of their stomach. Those kind of things. There's no blood necessarily. And then waterboarding, of course, the famous waterboarding we now have so much, that was used quite a lot. So yeah, it was sort of stretching them. I mean, obviously, it was very aggressive torture.
And generally, people fessed up. The very worst that could happen to you is still you get burnt at the stake, but this happened to very few people, right?
Yeah, it did continue to happen, but yeah, not to the same degree as as I said, the first 20 years. Very often, what would happen then was that the Inquisition would decide on the fines or whatever of these convicted conversos. If they convicted somebody, then if it was a first offense, you wouldn't be burnt at the stake anyway. Then you would be reconciled to the church. You would call it reconciliado, and you may be whipped. You may have a substantial amount of your property taken from you, but you wouldn't be burnt at the stake. The people who were burnt at the stake, they were known as relajados. It's a strange word because you think of relaxed. It certainly wasn't a relaxing thing, but they were called relajados. And then they were given to the secular arm of the Inquisition, because the Inquisition, the clerics themselves didn't want anything to do with this, So this wasn't the holy thing to do, to burn somebody at the stake. So they were given to the secular arm, taken to the outskirts of the city. Very often in Madrid, for example, the Puerta de Alcalá was often used to burn people at the stake.
Yes,
that's much
because you
later.
didn't want to burn the city down.
Yeah. So what you had a collection then of people who were ready, and then on a day you would have something called the auto de fe, and they'd be paraded in front of the town dignitaries. Very often, if it was Madrid, the court, but that took place at least in the 17th century in the Plaza Mayor, and then their sentences were read out to them, and those that were reconciled to the church would go off, and they would probably to be fined or to be placed incarcerated in their homes, very often for a certain amount of time, and the others then would be burnt at the stake. That was the process.
And so Teresa of Avila was investigated by the Inquisition, and this period, I believe it's 16th century, right?
Yeah.
Because it's Philip II's time. So was she, that's quite scary for her to stick her neck out and push for reform in the church, but she did so. What was the kind of upshot of her being investigated?
It was for something they called being an alumbrado. The alumbrado, again, they were mostly conversos, but the sect, it wasn't really a sect. It was a movement that began in and around Guadalajara in the early 16th century. And they were mystics, but they were private mystics. They didn't follow the precepts of mysticism, which was okay mysticism, which was the Franciscan mysticism. And they believed that, or at least it was said of them, they believed that they could receive God anywhere through mystical. They didn't have to do anything in particular. They just had to open themselves up to God's love, and they would receive the love of God. And at that moment, they were pure. See, they didn't need the sacrament. That moment they were pure, and in their purity they couldn't commit sin. And so it was said of them very often, oh yeah, well this was a good reason for licentiousness, and that they were screwing around. But of course, really the whole point of it was that they could gain God's love and grace outside the confines of the church that many of them weren't happy with anyway. So that's that movement. And then throughout the 16th century, mystics or people who were associated with mysticism from time to time got accused of being an alumbrado as well. And that was the case of Teresa and her early movement. They felt that she was that the mysticism somehow wasn't good mysticism. It was sort of the devil somehow was involved with it.
And any other ways that Conversos changed Spanish culture?
Well, I mean, that was the way that they attempted to change Spanish culture through the humanist movement.
So religious reform, then.
Through religious reform, yeah, and looking for sort of greater toleration. You see this in the Conversos' works very often, is that they're looking for a more tolerant society, naturally. Yeah, that was the way they changed society. Well, I mean, if you want to look at the Conversos in commerce, you'll find that that they were at the forefront of commerce in Spanish commerce in the 16th century, and very often not only the trade but the House of Trade in Seville, the map makers, really the Council of the Indies and the House of Trade in Seville, and that was the two groups that dealt with the New World and all the trade coming from the New World and all the communities in the New World. The Conversos were very active in that as intellectuals and as merchants.
And what has been the response in the Spanish academic world about this research that you've been doing into this community?
Well, today there's a new generation of historians, and they are much more accommodating. The earlier Spanish academics resisted the idea very often that Conversos were so prominent in what they understood as Spain's golden age. And the golden age was that period of the 16th century of letters and of the growth of the empire, which was generally thought was the result of kicking out the Jews and kicking out the Muslims from Spain, and then this great old Christian community now, having purified itself, created its great golden age. But of course, that is an absolute lie. The people that were at the forefront of this golden age were those people from the families that you'd kicked out. They were new Christians very often, and so there was a lot of resistance to that. More and more, people are getting on board with it. But what I find is that instead of tremendous resistance, there's just half resistance now. It's like, right, the Conversos were there, but they weren't that prominent. And we still have a basically old Christian golden age, which is the wrong way of looking at it. The golden age came out of the friction that was created in the 16th century through those expulsions and through this new group of people that was coming into society, and they wanted to change things. And if you don't recognize that fiction, you will not understand Spain's golden.
And that's a golden age of cultural flourishing. Can you name a particular figure from there?
Cervantes. The great Cervantes comes from a Converso background. I've looked into the background of Diego Velázquez, the painter Diego Velázquez, the paternal side of his family came from Portugal, and there's good reason to believe that he was also from a Converso background. In fact, to enter into the Noble Order of Santiago, he adopted another family. His grandparents, his grandparents were Juan Velázquez Moreno and Juana Mejia. He sidelined those for another family in Seville, another Velázquez family that weren't his family at all, but they did have a more acceptable profile of being hidalgos or sort of lower nobility, and he exchanged those for this. He exchanged his real maternal grandparents for those, so he could enter into the Noble Order of Santiago. Whether he did that because the maternal grandparents, who actually were tailors, were from a Jewish background as well, or whether it was just the fact that they were tailors and so this wouldn't have been accepted. So I don't know.
That's your next big project, though, isn't it? It's Velázquez, right?
That's right. Yeah, I want to look at Velázquez as not as Velázquez, the person who is very often seen as the person who was created at the court of Madrid of Philip IV, but somebody who came out of a humanist background in Seville, which was heavily Converso. That humanist community in Seville was very much Converso, and I look at Velázquez as a person with a humanist agenda, and this humanist agenda is also influenced by his own background, which I believe to have been a Converso.
Ah, interesting. So maybe we'll have another conversation about that in the future.
Love to.
But for now, is there anything that we haven't covered that you felt like you're really burning to say?
After 25 years on this, I'm not burning any longer, but I'm smoldering sometimes. Smoldering very often when I read. When I look at Wikipedia and I'm looking at somebody who I know comes from a Converso background, and they say, so and so who was from a well-known Hidalgo family from the Asturias. It's nonsense. All of these genealogies that very often scholars refer to that were created in the 16th and 17th century, they are not worth the paper they were written on. They're all made up. It's nonsense. And hence, you
because
get so many...
the idea... Oh, sorry.
No, you get so many of these intellectuals who come from the Asturias. Or from the north, from the mountains of the north, because that was felt that those were pure because they'd escaped the Muslim influence, they'd fled to the mountains. But in their day, in the 16th century, they were regarded as country bumpkins. These people, there was no reason why. They weren't the intellectual community of Spain. But if you look at your Wikipedia articles on some of these great Golden Age figures, they all seem to come from the Basque country or from the Asturias, which is risible. But yeah, it does. And it's repeated time and time again.
I guess the Hidalgo thing is something people might cling to because they were given sort of minor titles. It's like minor nobilities who say in exchange for having fought on the Christian side back in the day. So maybe it's kind of a proof of having been, very crusading on the part of the Christian side in medieval times.
Yeah, possibly, except that there weren't. You weren't given a title, or you weren't even given a piece of paper to sort of, as a kind of license saying, oh yes, you're from a Hidalgo family. It was just accepted in a community that you were, mostly because perhaps you had a little bit of land and you were a little bit better than it, so you were seen as an Hidalgo. Later on, when the king, when Philip II, Charles V, Philip II, Philip III, when they were strapped for cash, they sold certificates of Hidalguía, but the people that were buying those certificates of Hidalguía were Conversos. Exactly. They wanted to clean up their background, and so once you got your certificate, nobody was asking. Can I tell you one anecdote before I leave you?
Yeah.
Throw me off.
Well, I've got my two last questions to ask you before we finish anyway, but tell me your anecdote first.
Okay, well, what happened with Teresa? We were talking about Teresa de Avila. Her father, Juan Sanchez, Alfonso Sanchez. Once the family was accused of Judaizing and then by the Inquisition, they left Toledo and they went to live in Avila. So, they set up a home in Avila. He was a silk merchant, Teresa's father, and they did very well for themselves. And he clearly wanted to join the ranks of the Hidalgos. And so what happened at the time was that you could gain that by very often, if there was a local tax and you refused to pay it, then you would be investigated. Say, well, no, I'm an Hidalgo. I don't, because nobility didn't pay taxes. Okay, it was only the rank and file. So this is exactly what he did. He said, no, I'm an Hidalgo and I don't need to pay that tax. So they investigated. Well, the investigation basically was that he bribed an enormous number of people to say that he came from a Hidalgo background, spent an enormous amount of money, and he got his certificate. Or he was about to get it when somebody decided that they were going to check the Inquisition records, and they found out that the family actually had been prosecuted for Judaizing one generation back. So because he'd spent so much money on this, they didn't take his certificate of Hidalguía away from him, but they said he could only be an Hidalgo in Avila. So later on, Teresa's brother, who had left, he was a merchant. He had left Spain and he'd gone to live in Peru. And he said, "Can you send me a copy of the family's certificate of Hidalguía?" And she said, "Yeah. This may take some time, but I think you'll like the result." Well, when we do know, because we have a copy of that certificate, and the person who'd copied it took out only Hidalgo in Avila. So that's the story.
No one's going to be able to check over there anyway, so he'll get away with it. Well, it's been delightful talking to you. Before I wrap up, I always ask people 2 questions. The first one is, what's your favorite place in the city?
Well, my favorite place is the Retiro, or living very next to it. My favorite watering hole, or going out for a meal. I just love the terraza of the a plateria, which is a bar restaurant, which is just over the road from the Prado. So that's my favorite place.
Okay, I've never been there.
I've been for a while to go to eat out.
Okay.
Good prices. Nice wine.
Thank you for that tip. I'll be writing the new Lonely Planet guide soon, so I'm always on the lookout for new tips.
Oh, okay. Shame about Café Central. I would have said Café Central, but now it's just about to close. And anyway,
again,
of late his prices went up, and it wasn't as good.
What's your favorite Spanish word? That's my last question for you.
Fenomenal.
Okay, well, fenomenal, which means almost the same thing in English.
I know.
Well, they're not really, you wouldn't say phenomenal.
But they use it all the time, don't they?
Fantastic.
I use it all the time. Yeah. Phenomenal. Well, it's been really phenomenal.
Yes, phenomenal. Thank you for coming on the podcast. And if anyone wants to see Kevin talk and put some questions to him themselves, they can come to Secret Kingdom's bookshop on November 21st at 8 p.m. What day is that? Is it a Friday or Saturday?
I think it's a Friday, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Kevin.
Oh, thank you. Thank you again.
Okay.
See you soon. Bye.